1370, Stralsund, northern Germany. A group of merchants just defeated a king, not with armies, not with weapons, with something far more powerful. They controlled the salt, the timber, the wool, the grain. Every trade route from London to Novgorod, and they had just proven that money could crush crowns. This is the story of the Hanseatic League, the medieval merchants who built an empire without borders. In the year 1200, Europe was fragmented. Hundreds of small kingdoms, warring dukes, feudal lords fighting over land. Political power was everything, but along the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, something different was happening. Trade was growing, cities were rising, and merchants were getting rich. Lubeck was the center of it all. Founded in 1143 on the Baltic coast, this German city became a gateway between East and West. Russian furs and timber came through Lubeck. English wool passed through, Swedish iron, Polish grain. The city's merchants weren't nobles, they weren't warriors, they were businessmen. And they understood something powerful. Unity meant profit. Around ERC, Lubeck and Hamburg formed an alliance, a simple agreement. Protect each other's merchants. Share trade routes. Defend against pirates together. Other cities noticed. Rostock joined. Then Wismar, Stralsund, Danzig, Bremen, Cologne. By 1260, over 30 cities had joined this growing network. They called it the Hanse, the Guild. What we now know as the Hanseatic League. But this wasn't just a trade agreement. It was something Europe had never seen before. A commercial empire built on cooperation, not conquest. The League's power came from control. It dominated for crucial resources. Dried fish from Norway, grain from Poland and Prussia, timber from Sweden, salt from Lüneburg in Germany. Salt was especially valuable. No refrigeration existed. Salt preserved meat and fish. It kept armies fed during winter. It kept ships supplied on long voyages. Controlled the salt, controlled survival itself. The Hanseatic merchants established counters, trading posts in foreign cities. These weren't just warehouses, or fortified compounds with their own laws, their own courts, their own armies of clerks. 4 major counters emerged. Bergen in Norway, Novgorod in Russia, Bruges in Flanders, London in England. The contour in Novgorod was particularly important. It opened around 1200. Here, Hanseatic merchants bought Russian furs, wax, and honey. They sold German-manufactured goods and cloth. The profits were enormous. But Novgorod was dangerous. Russian princes were unpredictable. Winters were brutal. The journey took months through hostile territory. The merchants developed a system. Only trusted members could trade in Novgorod. Strict rules governed behavior. No one cheated. No one broke contracts. Reputation was everything. If you violated Hanseatic rules, you were expelled. Your goods were seized. Your family's business was destroyed. No city in the League would trade with you again. This discipline created trust. And trust created wealth. By 1300, the Hanseatic League controlled roughly 70% of Baltic trade. Over 70 cities were members. Their ships, called cogs, were the most advanced vessels in northern Europe. Flat-bottomed, sturdy, perfect for shallow coastal waters and rough seas. These ships carried millions of pounds of goods annually. Clothes from Flanders were thousands of marks. Timber from the Baltic forests. Barrels of herring caught off the Norwegian coast. The League even developed its own currency system. The Lubeck mark became the standard for trade. Cities minted coins following Lubeck's weight and purity. This standardization made commerce faster and easier. But wealth attracted enemies. The Kingdom of Denmark controlled the narrow straits between the Baltic and North Sea, the Sound. Every Hanseatic ship had to pass through Danish waters, and the Danish king saw an opportunity. King Valdemar IV. A Turk came to power in 1340. He was ambitious, ruthless. He needed money to rebuild his kingdom after years of civil war. So he looked at the Hanseatic ships sailing through his waters and decided to squeeze. He raised tolls, doubled them, then tripled them. Hanseatic merchants protested. Valdemar ignored them. In 1361, Valdemar made a bigger move. He invaded Gotland, an island in the Baltic Sea. Visby, the island's main city, was a wealthy Hanseatic trading post. Rich merchants, full warehouses, perfect target. Valdemar's army conquered Visby in one day. They massacred the defenders, seized the warehouses, took everything. The Hanseatic League faced a choice: accept the humiliation or fight back. But how do merchants fight a king? The League called a meeting in Cologne in 1367. Representatives from 77 cities attended. This was the first general assembly of the entire Hanse. They debated for weeks. Some wanted to negotiate, pay the tolls, make peace. Others demanded action. The hardliners won. Led by Lubeck, the League made a decision that would change everything. They would wage economic war. First, they imposed a total trade embargo on Denmark. No Hanseatic merchant could trade with Danish ports. Danish ships were banned from Hanseatic cities. Danish goods were confiscated. Denmark's economy depended on Hanseatic trade. The embargo hit immediately. Danish nobles couldn't export grain. Fishermen couldn't sell herring. The kingdom began bleeding money. But Valdemar didn't back down, so the League escalated. They hired mercenaries, raised a fleet, and in 1368 they attacked. Hanseatic ships, loaded with soldiers, sailed directly to Danish ports. They didn't try to conquer territory. They destroyed Denmark's ability to collect tolls. They burned Danish ships, blockaded harbors, cut off trade completely. This wasn't a traditional war. This was economic strangulation. By 1370, Denmark was choking. Nobles pressured Valdemar to make peace. The king, proud and stubborn, had no choice. The Treaty of Stralsund was signed in May 1370. The terms were humiliating for Denmark. The Hanseatic League won the right to approve the next Danish king. They gained control of 4 major Danish castles for 15 years. They received huge economic concessions and eliminated most tolls. A group of merchants had just forced a king to surrender, not through noble bloodlines or military conquest, through trade, coordination, and economic pressure. The League proved something revolutionary. Medieval Europe, money could defeat swords. Commercial power could overcome royal power. And they were just getting started. After Stralsund, the Hanseatic League reached its peak. Over 170 cities joined the network. From Cologne in the west to Reval in the east, from Stockholm in the north to Göttingen in the south, Arcade ships dominated every major port. The Connors in London, Bruges, Bergen, and Novgorod operated like independent states within foreign cities. They had their own legal systems, their own warehouses, their own churches. The Steelyard in London, established fully by 1320, was a fortress inside the city. High walls surrounded German merchants living separately from English society. They paid taxes directly to the League, not to the English king. English merchants resented this. German merchants live in our city, but follow their own rules, London's guilds complained. They grow rich while we pay taxes and obey our king. But England needed Hanseatic trade. German merchants brought essential goods, timber for shipbuilding, pitch and tar for waterproofing, grain during shortages. The English crown couldn't afford to expel them. It's the same pattern repeated across Europe. Local merchants hated the Hanseatic privileges. But local rulers needed Hanseatic goods. In Bruges, the Hanseatic Kantor controlled the cloth trade. Flemish weavers produced the finest textiles in Europe. But they needed English wool, which came through Hanseatic ships. And they needed buyers for finished cloth, which Hanseatic merchants provided. The League exploited this dependency ruthlessly. They negotiated tax exemptions, trading monopolies, legal privileges. City by city, privilege by privilege, they built commercial dominance. But success bred problems. Internal divisions grew. Lubeck, as the League's unofficial capital, made most decisions. But Cologne wanted more influence. Hamburg had its own ambitions. Danzig controlled massive grain exports and felt entitled to greater power. These cities competed as much as they cooperated. Lubeck merchants traded in timber. Cologne merchants specialized in wine. Hamburg focused on brewing and cloth. Danzig shipped grain. Their interests didn't always align. The first serious crack appeared in the late 1380s. England and the League clashed over fishing. Rights in the North Sea. English fishermen wanted access to herring grounds, the Hanseatics claimed. The League threatened another embargo. England responded differently than Denmark had. King Richard II was young, but advised by experienced counselors. They didn't fight directly. Instead, they supported English merchants forming their own trading companies. They offered subsidies for English shipbuilding. They slowly reduced dependence on Hanseatic trade. This was a new threat. Not military defeat, it's economic competition. Meanwhile, the eastern contour and Novgorod faced growing pressure. Ivan III became Grand Prince of Moscow in 1462. He was determined to unite Russian lands under Moscow's control. Novgorod's independence threatened his vision. The Hanseatic merchants in Novgorod operated with enormous freedom. They paid minimal taxes. They followed German law inside their compound. Russian princes couldn't touch them. Ivan III hated this arrangement. Foreign merchants rule in a Russian city, he said to his advisors. This is intolerable. In 1478, Ivan III conquered Novgorod. His army surrounded the city. The siege lasted months. When Novgorod finally surrendered, Ivan's revenge was swift. He closed the Hanseatic contour, seized German property, arrested German merchants. Some were executed. Others were ransomed back to the League for enormous sums. The eastern gateway of Hanseatic trade slammed shut. The League protested. They sent ambassadors. They threatened retaliation. But Ivan III controlled a vast land empire. He didn't need Hanseatic approval. The loss of Novgorod was a massive blow. Centuries of eastern trade disappeared. Russian furs, wax, and timber now flowed through Moscow's merchants, not German ones. The League tried to compensate by strengthening its other routes, but cracks kept appearing. In 1469, England temporarily closed the steel yard during a trade dispute. Though it reopened, the precedent was dangerous. New problems emerged from the south. The Dutch were rising. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and other Dutch cities built their own merchant fleets. Their ships, called flights, were cheaper to operate than Hanseatic cogs. They could carry more cargo with smaller crews. Dutch merchants offered lower prices. They undercut Hanseatic traders. Slowly, they took market share in grain, timber, and fish. The Hanseatic League tried to ban Dutch ships from member cities, but enforcement was difficult. Some Hanseatic cities secretly traded with the Dutch because their prices were better. Unity began fracturing. By 1494, another crisis hit. The Contar in Bruges, once the jewel of Hanseatic trade, faced disaster. The Zuin River, which connected Bruges to the sea, was silting up. Ships couldn't reach the city anymore. Trade shifted to Antwerp, a rival city. The Hanseatic merchants tried to move their operations, but Antwerp had different rules. It was more open, more competitive. Hanseatic privileges meant less there. The world was changing. New trade routes were opening. In 1492, Columbus reached the Americas. Vasco da Gama sailed to India. The economic center of Europe began shifting from the Baltic and North Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. Portugal, Spain, England, and the Dutch built ocean-going vessels that could cross the Atlantic. They found gold, silver, spices, and sugar. These new trades were far more profitable than Baltic timber and salt. The Hanseatic League couldn't compete. Their cogs were designed for coastal waters, not oceans. Their business model was built on controlling regional monopolies. But the world was becoming global. Internal conflicts intensified. In Yiwu-Seni, Lubeck, and Denmark went to war again. This time, other Hanseatic cities refused to join. Hamburg stayed neutral. Danzig sided with Denmark. The unity that made the League powerful evaporated. The war ended badly for Lubeck. They lost territory, lost trade privileges. Their authority within the League diminished. By 1550, the Hanseatic League was clearly declining. Cities started leaving, some joined new alliances. Others pursued independent trade policies. The general assemblies that once commanded obedience became ineffective debates. Religious conflicts added to the chaos. The Protestant Reformation split Northern Europe. Catholic cities and Protestant cities within the League fought each other. Trade networks that crossed religious lines became difficult to maintain. In 1598, Queen Elizabeth I of England made a final move. She closed the Steelyard permanently. 400 years of Hanseatic presence in London ended. The compound was sold. The merchants were expelled. English trade for English merchants, the Queen declared. The age of foreign trading privileges was over. The Bergen contour, isolated in Norway, struggled on, but by 1630, it too was barely functioning. Local Norwegian merchants demanded control of their own trade. The Norwegian king agreed. The empire built on salt and timber and merchant discipline was crumbling. The question now was how much longer it could survive. The final meeting of the Hanseatic League was held in 1669 in Lubeck. Only 9 cities sent representatives. Down from 170 at the League's height. They discussed the usual matters: trade disputes, piracy, diplomatic relations. But everyone in the room knew the truth. The Hanse, as a functioning organization, was finished. No formal dissolution occurred. The League simply faded. Cities stopped sending delegates. Contors closed one by one. The last contor in Bergen finally shut in 1754, over 80 years after the final assembly. The reasons for collapse were clear. The world had moved on. Nation-states replaced loose confederations. Kings and queens centralized power. They built their own navies, created their own merchant classes, imposed their own laws. The Hanseatic business model depended on weak central authority. When governments were fragmented, merchant leagues could negotiate privileges. But strong nation-states didn't need to negotiate. They simply commanded. Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands built ocean empires. They traded in silver from Mexico, sugar from the Caribbean, spices from Indonesia. Baltic timber couldn't compete with Atlantic gold. The Dutch became the commercial masters of the 1600s. Their East India Company dwarfed anything the Hanseatic League ever created. It had its own army, its own currency, and its own colonial empire. The scale was incomparable. Technology also changed. Better shipbuilding techniques made longer voyages possible. Improved navigation tools opened new routes. The printing press spread commercial knowledge faster. Individual merchants could access information that once required a massive network. But the League's decline wasn't total failure. Its legacy shaped modern commerce in profound ways. Hanseatic cities remained wealthy long after the League dissolved. Lubeck, Hamburg, and Bremen were major trading centers. Their medieval prosperity built foundations for future success. Hamburg is still Germany's largest port today. The League pioneered commercial concepts that modern businesses use: standardized contracts, international arbitration, trade regulations, quality control, collective bargaining, risk-sharing across partnerships. The Lubeck Law, developed by Hanseatic merchants, became the basis for commercial law across Northern Europe. Over 100 cities adopted it. Its principles influenced legal systems for centuries. The League also proved that economic cooperation could achieve what military force couldn't. They built an empire without conquering territory. They influenced kings without commanding armies. Money, organization, and discipline were their weapons. This lesson resonated through history. The Dutch East India Company studied Hanseatic methods. The British Empire learned from Hanseatic trading posts. Modern trade alliances, from the European Union to ASEAN, echo the League's model of economic unity without political merger. The Contors introduced another concept that lasted: corporate residences in foreign countries. Today we call them embassies and consulates for nations, or regional offices for corporations. But the idea started with Hanseatic merchants living in fortified compounds in foreign cities, operating under their own rules. The League's emphasis on reputation and trust created early credit systems. A merchant's word was his bond. Break it, and you're expelled from the network. This social enforcement of business contracts preceded modern legal systems. It showed that commerce could police itself through reputation. Historian Philippe Dollinger, who wrote extensively on the Hanse, concluded, "The Hanseatic League was not a state, but it functioned like one. It was not a company, but it traded like one. It was something Europe had never seen before and would never see again." The League's story teaches us about the limits of commercial power. Economic strength can challenge political authority, but it can't replace it permanently. Without military force or formal government structure, the League eventually fragmented. It teaches us that monopolies never last. The Hanseatic merchants controlled Baltic trade for 3 centuries. But competition always emerges. New technologies appear. Trade routes shift. What seems permanent today becomes obsolete tomorrow. It teaches us that cooperation requires constant maintenance. The League succeeded when cities unified around common interests. It failed when internal divisions grew stronger than external threats. Unity is fragile. Self-interest is powerful. Most importantly, it teaches us that geography and technology determine trade routes. The League rose because the Baltic Sea was the highway of Northern Europe. It fell because Atlantic Ocean routes became more important. You can't fight geography with organization alone. Today, when we talk about free trade agreements, we're discussing Hanseatic ideas. When corporations negotiate with governments for tax breaks, they're using Hanseatic strategies. When cities compete to attract businesses by offering incentives, they're repeating medieval patterns. The Hanseatic League showed that merchants could be as powerful as kings, that trade networks could rival empires, that money, properly organized, could reshape the world. For 400 years, from the 1200s to the 1600s, a confederation of merchant cities controlled northern European commerce. They had no king, no army, no country, just ships, warehouses, and unbreakable business rules. They built an empire of trade that kings couldn't destroy and rivals couldn't match, until the world changed around them, until oceans replaced seas, until nations replaced networks. The Hanseatic League proved that economic power can dominate for centuries. But it also proved that nothing dominates forever. Markets evolve, routes shift, empires fall. Even empires built on salt and timber and merchant discipline. Money and power are always connected. But the connection is never permanent. Subscribe for more deep financial history documentaries.